In the summer of 1891, a man named James Stevenson sat in a canvas tent at the edge of Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, and wrote in his field journal that what the Navajo guides had described to him that morning was, and his exact phrase, not consistent with any known use of the structures. He did not sketch what they pointed to. He moved on to the next line, which was about pottery shards, and no official report from the Bureau of American Ethnology's survey that year ever mentioned what the guides had said. Not one sentence. I found this because I was not looking for it. I had been working through the physical survey records of Chaco Canyon between 1888 and 1902, trying to understand why so many of the great kivas showed evidence of floor disturbance that was neither collapse nor erosion but something deliberate. Human hands working after the ancestral Puebloans had gone. A footnote in an unpublished field memorandum held in the Smithsonian Institution archives sent me sideways into a set of notes that should not, if the official record were complete, have been kept separately at all. And what I found in those notes was the thing Stevenson had chosen not to write down. It was a description. Specific, physical, repeated across multiple independent sources spanning 11 years. It was what the Navajo said about pools of reflected light in rooms that had been empty, according to the accepted timeline, for 6 centuries. By the time we reach the end of this, you will understand what those pools were, what they were built to do, and why every field worker who accurately recorded the Navajo accounts of them was prevented from including those accounts in the published literature. I want to be honest with you about what I can prove and what I can only place in front of you. I cannot tell you with certainty what the Navajo guide showed Stevenson that morning. What I can give you is a documented trail held across 3 separate institutional archives, recorded by 4 different field workers working independently across more than a decade, that converges on a single description of a single impossible feature. Something in those kiva floors was reflective. Something had been installed, with considerable material knowledge and considerable effort, to catch light at specific times of year. And the people who preserved the memory of what that something was were, in every instance I have found, either not quoted or actively discouraged from being heard. Chaco Canyon is strange before you add anything to it. The great houses, Pueblo Bonito, Chetroqueto, Pueblo del Arroyo, were not villages in any ordinary sense. They were built in one of the most water-scarce environments in North America, along a trade corridor connecting the Gulf of California to the Rocky Mountain foothills, aligned to solar and lunar cycles with an accuracy that still gives modern archaeoastronomers serious pause. The road system radiating outward from Chaco, carefully graded, precisely engineered, in some sections more than 30 feet wide, extends for hundreds of miles across terrain, where a curved road following natural contours would have been dramatically simpler to construct. And yet every road is straight. Because straight roads, in many ceremonial traditions, are not about efficiency. They are about sight lines. They are about something that needs to see and be seen across a full, unbroken distance. Consider what the kivas at Chaco actually were. They were not sleeping quarters, not granaries. The word kiva comes from the Hopi language and means, in its most direct translation, world below, a ceremonial chamber, partially subterranean, representing in Pueblo tradition the place of emergence, the threshold through which the people entered this world from the one before. The floors of the great kivas measure up to 60 feet in diameter. Their walls were plastered and repainted many times, the paint sequences in some rooms indicating continuous ceremonial use across 2 centuries or more. At the center of several of them, early 20th century excavations revealed small sealed recesses set into the floor, features lined with carefully worked stone, too shallow for storage, and aligned, in at least 2 independently documented cases. so that during the winter solstice, sunrise a bounded shaft of light would enter the recess and strike its interior surface at a specific angle for a window of only a few minutes. This is not interpretation. It is in the survey notes of Neil Judd, who directed the National Geographic Society's excavations at Chaco between 1921 and 1927. Judd noted the recesses. He noted their orientations. He noted that their stone linings bore evidence of careful surface preparation he could not characterize. And then he wrote that the interior surfaces of these features appeared to have been treated with a substance that was no longer present. He did not speculate about what it had been. He simply noted its absence and moved on, as if whatever had once lined those recesses had been expected to be gone before anyone arrived to ask about it. No longer present. That is the whole problem in 6 words, because by the time Judd's team reached those recesses in the early 1920s, someone had already removed whatever had lined them. The disturbance signatures in the surrounding soil, visible even in the published reports of the excavation, are consistent with access that postdated the ancestral Puebloans' departure from the site and predated Judd's work by decades. Someone entered those kivas in that intervening window. The question is not whether something was removed. The evidence of removal is in the record. The question is who entered, and when, and whether they understood what they were taking. I want to tell you what the Navajo guides described to James Stevenson in that canyon in the summer of 1891, because the description is specific enough to have originated in direct observational knowledge transmitted through a careful tradition. The account does not appear in the official Bay report. It appears in the private field notes of Frank Hamilton Cushing, who was present for part of that survey season, and who kept a separate personal journal alongside the official documentation, a practice that made him, in retrospect, one of the most valuable sources in the archive, because what he wrote for himself was not edited for what it was permissible to believe. That journal was donated to the Southwest Museum of the American Indian in Los Angeles in 1937 by Cushing's widow, and it survives as a typed transcription prepared by a graduate student in 1964, a transcription that, to my knowledge, has never been published in any form. In those notes, Cushing recorded that one of the Navajo men, he gives the man's name as Hestian Nez, meaning simply tall man, walked the survey team into the interior of one of the larger kivas at Pueblo Bonito, stood at the center of the room, and described what the chamber had once held. The word Cushing uses in his transcription is pools of silver, set into the floor, that held the stars inside them in winter. Not metaphor, not ceremony. Physical description. I want to be careful here, because a single account in an unpublished personal journal is suggestive and nothing more. It points. It does not establish. What makes it significantly harder to put aside is what appeared when I went searching for independent corroboration of what Heston Nez described. There are at least 3 other accounts in the ethnographic record, recorded by different field workers, with different Navajo informants, across different years, with no documented connection among the informants, that describe something functionally identical. Victor Mindeleff, who conducted detailed architectural surveys of Chaco and surrounding sites for the bay beginning in 1888, recorded a conversation with a Navajo elder, in which the elder described the old rooms at Chaco as having been made for watching water, without water. Mindeleff's notes are in the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian, Box 34, Folder 7. I found the passage. It is reproduced nowhere in his published monograph on Pueblo architecture. Not quoted, not paraphrased, not referenced, not acknowledged. It does not exist in the published record at all. Washington Matthews is the second source, and his name carries particular weight here because his documentation of Navajo ceremonial life is considered among the most careful and respectful produced by any fieldworker of that era. He learned the language at professional depth and was trusted with access other researchers were denied. In an 1896 letter to John Wesley Powell, director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, Matthews wrote that among the Navajo families he had worked with most closely, there was a specific and consistently used term. He renders it approximately as Hasbi-Niti, which he translates as the ones that kept the still reflection, used specifically to describe certain interior rooms in the old Anasazi ruins. Matthews told Powell the term described a real physical feature and that dedicated fieldwork resources were needed to document it properly. Powell's reply does not appear in the correspondence record. The thread simply stops. The third account is the one I have not been able to explain away, regardless of how long I return to it. In 1902, George Pepper, who had directed the Hyde Exploring Expedition's excavations at Pueblo Bonito from 1896 to 1900, the most extensive excavation the site had seen, filed a supplemental field report with the American Museum of Natural History that was never incorporated into his major published monograph on the site, and never publicly cited until Gordon Vivian referenced it briefly. In a footnote, in a 1953 paper on Chaco architecture, I requested the document from the Amanish archives. It arrived as a photocopy of 31 handwritten pages. In those pages, Pepper described the opening of a sealed chamber beneath the northwestern quadrant of Pueblo Bonito's main kiva. A chamber his crew accessed in the late autumn of 1899, which bore no evidence of entry since the site's abandonment around 1150 C. Inside, he wrote, they found the floor covered entirely in a layer of powdered specular hematite, iron oxide ground to such uniformity and such fineness that it produced a near-mirrored surface across the entire area of the chamber floor. He estimated the total quantity at not less than 40 pounds. 40 pounds of a mineral that, when prepared to this quality, reflects light with the characteristics of polished metal, applied not to a wall, not to a ceremonial object, not to a burial preparation, but to the floor of a sealed underground room. And Pepper recorded that when his crew first opened the chamber and their lantern light entered, the effect was, in his exact phrase, indistinguishable from still water. His crew thought the floor was wet. They stopped at the threshold. They believed, for a moment, that they were looking at a pool. This is the part I keep returning to. Because what Heston Nez described to Cushing in 1891, pools of silver that held stars inside them in winter, is not poetic license once you understand what specular hematite does in direct light. It is not legend. It is transmitted observational memory, maintained across generations with enough precision that it still pointed accurately to a physical feature of those rooms that Pepper's sealed chamber later confirmed had existed. The Navajo were not speaking in myth when they said the rooms held stars. They were describing, with technical accuracy, chambers designed to function as astronomical mirrors, floors surfaced to reflect the sky, oriented to receive a precise shaft of winter solstice light, so that the movement of the sun could be tracked not from above the earth, but from within it, from inside the world below, from inside the place whose name described exactly what it was built to do. Consider what that represents as a technology, an astronomical instrument built below ground, requiring no aperture except a precisely dimensioned opening in the roof, using the prepared floor as the observational surface, and producing, in a room of total darkness except for a single shaft of controlled light, a reflection stable enough to track the sun's path against a reference point with the accuracy the solstice orientations require. The specular hematite used to achieve this finish was not casually applied. Materials scientists who have studied hematite artifacts from other Chacoan sites have described the processing required for comparable surface quality as involving methods not yet fully reconstructed from the material record alone, because the people who knew how to do this at that scale were not given the opportunity to teach what they knew. And then the material was removed from the open kiva floors. Not from Pepper's sealed chamber, which his crew resealed, and which had not been opened since the community that built it walked away 7.5 centuries earlier. But from the rooms the Navajo guides walked Stevenson into in 1891, the rooms with recesses that Judd documented 30 years later as containing only the ghost of a preparation that was no longer there, someone had already been. The timing matters considerably. The Bureau of American Ethnology conducted its first major survey of Chaco Canyon in 1877. There is a gap in the continuity of the survey record between 1877 and 1888. And in the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives, Box 12 of the Bay Administrative Correspondence from that period contains a letter signed by John Wesley Powell and dated 1882. Authorizing the removal of what he calls certain objects of a reflective character from survey sites throughout the San Juan Basin. The letter specifies that the objects are to be shipped to Washington for further study, and that the published survey reports for those sites should not enumerate them. I have read this letter. There is no corresponding receipt anywhere in the archive, no inventory of what was shipped, no record of what arrived or where it subsequently went. The letter exists. The objects do not. This was not unique to Chaco. The Great Kiva at Aztec Ruins, 30 miles to the north, was reconstructed by archaeologist Earl Morris in 1934. And Morris's field diary, held at the American Museum of Natural History, records his observation that the original floor surface, beneath his reconstruction layer, contained traces of specular hematite distributed in a pattern consistent with deliberate application across a wide area. That observation does not appear in his published account of the reconstruction. At Mesa Verde, the astronomical Kiva features show the same secondary disturbance signature, and Ute oral tradition preserved in early ethnographic interviews describes the old ceremonial rooms as the ones that used to have mirrors in the floor. At Canyon de Chelly, where Navajo families have lived continuously since before Spanish contact, accounts collected by early ethnographers from elders who had visited the White House ruin, as young people describe the inner chambers as once having contained what the elders translated as the water that was not water, and when asked to explain what this meant, they said it was what their grandparents called the things in the floors, the things that had been inside before the men who wrote things down arrived and took what was there. The men who wrote things down came, and what they published was a version of what they found from which the most significant observations had been removed, with the same systematic consistency with which the materials had been removed from the floors. The rooms were recorded. The contents were taken. The reports appeared without the relevant passages. The structure was preserved. The meaning was extracted. The Navajo who walked those ruins in the 1890s were not romantic informants adding texture to a Western academic enterprise. They were custodians of a knowledge tradition of extraordinary duration, a tradition whose precision is demonstrated by the fact that what they described to Cushing, to Mendeleev, and to Matthews pointed, with accuracy, to a physical reality that Pepper's sealed and untouched chamber later confirmed. When Hestine Nez stood in the Kiva at Pueblo Bonito and described pools that held stars in winter, he was transmitting an observation that had passed through many mouths across many generations and still arrived at its destination intact, still pointing at the thing it had always described. The field workers who received that description understood it. Their private notes make that clear. What they were unable to do, what the institutional structure they operated within did not permit them to do, was carry it into print without the passages being removed between the note and the page. What we lost at Chaco is not the material alone. Though 40 pounds of mirror-ground hematite in a sealed kiva floor is a loss with no remedy, what we lost is the knowledge system that understood what to do with it and why. The reflective floors were not a curiosity. They were components of a coherent astronomical and ceremonial framework maintained across a geographic network spanning hundreds of miles, connected by those straight roads, sustained through a tradition that the surviving Pueblo communities, Navajo, Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Laguna, have carried forward in forms that still exist. But a tradition stripped from its physical referent becomes story. Once it is story, it requires no investigation. Once it is myth, the institutions that replace the thing it describes have no obligation to respond to it. They simply wait for the generation that remembers the rooms to pass, and then they commission the excavation reports. And the reports say nothing unusual was found, because the unusual things had been removed before anyone wrote a word. That is what they were counting on. Not a dramatic conspiracy. Something quieter and more durable. An institutional habit of selective preservation that kept the shell of the record while removing its content. And a publication system that translated fieldwork observations into authorized knowledge through a translation that always, in these cases, lost exactly the same thing. The rooms were real. The material was real. The Navajo who described it were describing something that evidence in a sealed chamber later confirmed. The only reason any of this is genuinely uncertain today is that specific people, in specific institutional positions, at specific moments in the 1870s and 1880s, made deliberate decisions about what the record would contain. Those decisions are themselves in the archive. They are simply not easy to find, because finding them requires knowing to look for what is absent. And you can only know to look for what is absent if someone tells you it was once there. If this stays with you, share it with someone who still believes the archive is complete. Because it was never complete. It was a selection. And the question worth asking is, who made that selection? And what they needed you never to think to ask.